Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always excited to explore new topics.
Well, today we're getting into something pretty juicy. We're going to be talking about personality.
Ooh, sounds intriguing.
It is. Specifically, how certain personality traits can impact relationships. Like, could your personality actually lead to divorce?
Now, that's a question I'm sure a lot of people are curious about.
We're basing our deep dive on this article from Psychology Today, written by Dr. Mark Travers.
Okay.
It's called One Personality Trait That Drives Couples to Divorce More Than Any Other. Dramatic title, right?
Definitely grabs your attention. So what's this potentially marriage-ending trait we're talking about?
Well, the article dives deep into neuroticism
Neuroticism. Okay.
and how it can impact relationships. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you give us like a quick breakdown of what neuroticism actually is?
Sure. You can think of neuroticism as kind of a tendency towards emotional instability.
Emotional instability.
Yeah. And like really strong reactions to, well, just about everything.
So kind of like easily triggered.
Yeah, exactly. People who score high in neuroticism, they just tend to experience these more negative emotions, way more intensely and way more frequently than other folks.
Hmm.
It's like their emotional thermostat is just cranked up a little too high.
Ah, I see. So even small things can feel like a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
Imagine like your partner forgets to pick up milk on the way home from work.
right. A pretty common thing.
Totally. But for someone high in neuroticism, this little slip up can trigger all kinds of stuff. Anger, anxiety, even this sense of like feeling unloved or neglected.
Wow.
Yeah. It's all about these like really disproportionate reactions to things that other people might just brush off.
And I imagine that kind of dynamic doesn't exactly make for a peaceful home life, does it?
Not really, no. The article actually brings up this 2020 study from BMC Psychology.
Okay.
And they found that this, what they call like a negativity bias in people who are highly neurotic.
Negativity bias.
Yes. So basically, they tend to see everything in a more negative light.
Oh,
Often leads to these minor disagreements
right.
escalating into huge blowouts.
Ah, so they're kind of primed for conflict in a way?
Yeah, you could say that. They tend to see like even neutral or sometimes even positive situations through this really negative lens.
Interesting. Some more arguments, more tension. But wouldn't their partner, like, eventually just learn to ignore it? Just be like, oh, there they go again.
Well, you'd think so, right? But it's not that simple.
Okay.
The article talks about this family systems theory.
Family systems theory.
It basically suggests that couples are emotionally connected.
Right.
So like one person's negativity can really impact the other person. It's like this ripple effect.
So even if one partner's trying to stay calm, they're still getting pulled into that negativity.
Yeah, unfortunately that tends to happen. Just imagine, living with someone who's constantly on edge, always seeing threats where there really aren't any. Over time, that constant tension and negativity can really take a toll on both people in the relationship. It's like walking through a minefield.
You never know when you're going to step on something.
Exactly.
Okay, starting to see how this could really lead to a cycle of conflict. But the article also mentions it's not just about the arguments, right? This whole neuroticism thing impacts the emotional connection too.
It does, yeah. And that's actually where things get even more interesting.
I'm all ears. Tell me more about that connection.
So because of this intense emotional reactivity and the negativity bias, highly neurotic people often have trouble making their partners feel like really understood and cared
Right.
for.
Oh, I see.
They might be so focused on their own anxieties and frustrations that they just completely miss the cues from their partner.
Ah, so it's like they're so caught up in their own world.
Exactly. And that can lead to a lot of miscommunication and hurt feelings.
So not intentional neglect, but almost like a kind of emotional blindness.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And there's actually a 2022 study in Frontiers in Psychology that supports this.
Okay.
It found that this high emotional reactivity is linked to lower levels of something called perceived partner responsiveness.
Perceived partner responsiveness. So basically how much a partner feels like their needs are being met.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. You could be physically present with someone, but still make them feel completely emotionally abandoned.
Yeah, absolutely. And that lack of emotional support, that feeling of not being heard or understood, it can really slowly start to chip away at the foundation of the relationship.
So it's like one partner's neuroticism is creating this emotional distance in the marriage.
Yeah, and, you know, without that feeling of being understood, being supported, the relationship can just wither.
Right, like a plant that's not getting enough water or sun.
Exactly.
And I'm guessing that lack of emotional nourishment can eventually lead to the big D word.
Sadly, yeah, sometimes. The article mentions how these negative patterns, if they just keep going on, it creates this downward spiral. Resentment, withdrawal, and ultimately a breakdown of the relationship.
So, not exactly a recipe for a happy marriage, but
Yeah.
is there like any hope for couples where one or both partners are dealing with neuroticism? Or is it just like a relationship death sentence?
No, not at all. The article really stresses that it's all about self-awareness and emotional regulation.
Okay.
Couples can absolutely learn to manage this and build stronger, more fulfilling relationships.
So, there's room for growth and change. That's good to hear. So, tell me more about that. How can couples actually work through this?
Well, it really starts with, recognizing those negative thought patterns and reactions.
Okay.
Therapy can be super helpful.
Right.
Developing coping mechanisms, communication skills.
So instead of like just reacting impulsively, they can learn to kind of pause and then respond in a healthier way.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
It's all about taking those emotional landmines and diffusing them before they, blow up the relationship.
I like that analogy.
And remember, relationships are a two-way street.
Right.
Both partners need to be putting in the effort to understand each other's needs
Yeah.
and create a more positive dynamic.
So it's not just about the neurotic individual changing, it's about like creating a supportive environment where both partners feel safe and understood.
Yeah, absolutely. The article actually talks about this other personality trait, conscientiousness,
Conscientiousness.
and how it plays a role. So conscientious individuals, they're generally more organized, responsible, less reactive, which often leads to greater relationship satisfaction.
So it's not just about like avoiding the negative, it's also about cultivating positive traits.
Exactly. Conscientious it's like this stable foundation for the relationship.
Ah, okay.
These individuals, they manage stress well, they create this really predictable and reliable environment, generally bring a sense of calm to the partnership.
It's almost like having an anchor in the middle of a storm.
Exactly. That sense of stability and security can be so reassuring for a partner who's maybe struggling with their own emotional stuff.
Right.
It allows them to feel safe enough to open up, communicate, and work together to, weather those rough waters.
Makes sense. So we've talked a lot about the downsides of neuroticism, but is there anything positive about this trait? Could it actually be a strength in some ways?
That's a great question. Maybe a little bit of neuroticism keeps things interesting or even fuels creativity and passion. I mean,
Yeah.
intense emotions, they can be a really powerful force.
Intriguing. So maybe it's not about like getting rid of neuroticism completely, but more about finding ways to, I don't know, harness its energy, channel it in a more positive direction.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. It's all about finding that balance where the intensity of emotions can be expressed in a healthy and constructive way.
Well, folks, it looks like we've reached the end of our deep dive into neuroticism and relationships. We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have explored the challenges, the potential for growth.
Definitely a lot to think about. Hopefully, this is giving you some food for thought and maybe spark some interesting conversations with your partner.
Yeah, definitely.
And maybe even taking a look in the mirror, right? Like thinking about our own
Oh,
tendencies.
absolutely. Self-awareness is so key. It's about understanding your own emotional patterns. What are your triggers? And how can you learn to like manage those reactions in a way that brings you closer to your partner instead of pushing you apart?
So it's not about trying to like completely change who you are, but more about like working with what you've got.
Yeah, exactly. It's about personal growth, but within the context of, a loving and supportive relationship.
I love that. Well, on that note, I think we'll leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder. So we talked about how a little neuroticism can actually be a good thing, right? Like it can fuel passion, creativity. So how can we find that sweet spot where those more intense emotions become a source of strength instead of a source of stress in our relationships?
That's a great question, something to really think about.
It is. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into neuroticism and relationships. Thanks for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.